So hello and welcome everyone to the webinar. This is going to be an hour-long webinar. My name is Jocelyn Rousey. I'm the Communications Coordinator for the Schott Foundation for Public Education. Thank you very much for being here today. So this is going to be a 1 hour-long webinar about two reports that were released this past month, one by the Schott Foundation for Public Education and the other by the African American Policy Forum. You can see both covers on your screen right now on the first slide. These two reports, kind of taken together, paint a really important picture of some of the challenges that young men and young women of color face in our nation's public schools. And they illustrate the importance of using a dual race and gender lens in all of the work that we do, whether that's working with kids hands-on in the classroom or as advocates or policymakers or researchers. So we are lucky today to have the heads of both Schott and the African American Policy Forum here with us today to discuss the reports. We're going to have Dr. John Jackson speaking first about Schott's reports, and then we'll pass the baton off to Kimberly Crenshaw from the African American Policy Forum to discuss their report. After that, we'll be opening up for some questions and a Q&A. Because we do have so many people on the line today, I want to let you all know that the lines are going to stay muted. Instead, if you would please use the chat box. Should be either over on the right-hand side of your screen or on the floating down from the top of your screen, and send us your questions in that way. I'll be monitoring the questions as they come in throughout the webinar, and we'll pass them off to Dr. Jackson and Professor Crenshaw as we go through the event. So with that said, let's get started. John, take us away.
Thank you, Jocelyn, and thank you everyone who's participating in this discussion. I'm happy to share this discussion and platform with Professor Crenshaw and as an opportunity to highlight the great work that they did with their report. First of all, when we are talking about the issues impacting African American males and females, in many respects we're talking about issues that are specific to these groups, but at the same time issues that will impact entire communities, entire states, and our entire country. So in many respects, these reports highlight yellow canary issues that, if not addressed, will soon spread and become lost opportunities for our country. Next slide. The report that Schott published, it's our 6th edition of our biennial report on 50-state report on public education and black males. This year we were happy to do it and have the Metropolitan Center, Pedro Noguera Center, publish the data and analyze the data for us, as well as Michelle Alexander to do the forward and Pedro Noguera to do the afterwards. So we were happy to have this level of collaboration in publishing this edition. Next slide. Next slide. One of the things I want to point out is during the release of this report, we also issued and released a video. And the video is to highlight that as we talk about these populations, we're not talking about a population that we enter into the discussion about from a deficit model. Black males have made a significant contribution to our country, communities, states. A significant percentage of American veterans are black males. Blacks in general give more, 25% more of their income to philanthropic causes than any other ethnic subgroup, as well as there are over 2 million black males with a college degree currently and 1 million enrolled in college now. So again, we highlight this as issues that address a population that presents so many opportunities to states in our country. We publish these data because we know that you measure what matters. And in many states and localities across the country, it's easier right now to find the incarceration rate than it is to find the graduation rate. The states and localities are publishing those numbers, but they're not annually publishing graduation data that is disaggregated by race and gender. And by not publishing it, it sends a message that it doesn't matter. And we want, through this report, we want to send a message that having these data available for policymakers, for parents, for advocates is very important. Otherwise, you create a population of what we call invisible men, invisible students from a perspective of many of the states have been using different methodologies to calculate graduation rates or dropout rates. In some states, in order for a student to be calculated as dropping out, that student would have to leave the school, call the school back, and say, I'm not coming back. Otherwise, the student remains a part of that cohort until he or she ages out of the public education system. So you have students who are not in the classroom but are still in the cohort. You also have what we call invisible diplomas. States like Louisiana that have created different diplomas that in many respects are really just certificates of attendance, because those diplomas can't be used then to enter into the state's own post-secondary institutions. And finally, I mentioned that there's a lack of positive data. We can analyze and find the data on Black male incarceration rates, but we should be able to find the data on graduation rates and other positive aspects that really tell the true and holistic story about the contributions of Black males. Next slide. Nationally, through this report, we discovered that nationally, the projected estimate for the Black male graduation rate from 4 years is 58%. And as you see by this map, based on the region of the country, there are very different results. We are most alarmed by what we see in the southern region because the largest population of Black males are enrolled in the southern region. But as you see in the majority of the southern region, the Black male graduation rate is between 50 and 59%. We're also alarmed by what's happening in New York, particularly New York City, where the Black male graduation rate isn't over 25%, but yet New York enrolls the largest percentage, New York City enrolls the largest percentage of Black males as for a city. So there is a lot of work that still needs to occur. Next slide. So if you notice in the report, we highlight the states that have the highest Black male graduation rate. States like Maine, Idaho, Arizona, South Dakota. I would note that those states that have the highest Black male graduation rate are states where the Black male enrollment is so small that they can't easily be isolated or relegated to under-resourced spaces. And what it shows is that in many respects, where they're educated and have access to the resources, they perform on par or in some cases even better than the white male population. Likewise, when we looked at the highest states, Tennessee and New Jersey were the only two states that had over 100,000 Black male enrollment that were within the top 10. So it indicates that those are two states that warrants further investigation as to the policies and practices which are creating these positive outcomes. Likewise, I mentioned already that among the lowest states, the majority of those states were located in the South, and that's something that has to be addressed. Among the lowest 10, none of the lowest 10 had a Black male graduation rate above 55%. Next slide. We also took a look at the state level of the Latino graduation rate, because in 48 states where we have reliable data, in 35 of those states, Black males were at the bottom as it relates to 4-year graduation rates, and another 13 Latino males were at the bottom. Again, as the slide indicates, states where Latino males graduated at a very high rate: Alaska, Maine, West Virginia. You see New Jersey again. In places, in some of the lowest states, you see Colorado, Michigan, New Mexico. Again, seemingly following population trends. The higher the population, it seems that the more difficult it is as it relates to the four-year graduation rate. The lower the population, the higher the graduation rate. Warrants further investigation around those trends. Next slide. And then there were some states that did relatively well with the graduation rate for both Black and Latino males. Again, states like Idaho, Maine, New Jersey, Tennessee, West Virginia. And then likewise, there were states that did very poorly as it relates to Black and Latino males. We include the District of Columbia in there as a political statement that one day the District of Columbia will achieve some level of statehood. But at the same time, the District of Columbia, Georgia, Michigan, and Nevada needs to take a serious look at the policies and practices that are preventing Black males and Latino males from graduating from high school in 4 years at a relatively high rate. Next slide. We also looked at the districts where there were more than 10,000 Black males enrolled because this is representative of what we call large urban districts. And, in summary, cities like, in counties like Montgomery County, Baltimore County, Fort Bend, Texas, are counties where the Black male graduation rate was relatively high. Montgomery County, 74%, Baltimore County, 64%. These are counties that have been in previous publications of our report as having high graduation rates. Likewise, we see places like Detroit, Philadelphia, Richmond County, in New York City, who are still struggling relative to their graduation rates, going as low as 20% in Detroit. Again, these are the projected estimates. The projected estimates that we used a proven or a effective methodology, moving average methodology, to project these estimates. I will say that the most accurate data comes from the state and district level. The very fact that they are not publishing these data annually causes institutions to project estimates. At the Schott Foundation, we would, quite frankly, like to be out of the business of publishing this report. But the only way we're going to do that is if there is a commitment at the state and local level to make these data available. Next slide. So, in short, if Black Lives Matter, which this report is an affirmation that indeed Black Lives Matter, and Black Lives Matter because they matter as fathers, as engineers, as husbands, as sons, and Black lives don't just matter when they die. Black lives matter when they are alive. And if that's the case, then climate equality has to matter also. Next slide. Climate from a perspective of creating the type of healthy living and learning ecosystem where males of color can thrive, and where there's in a climate where they're pushed out of school or locked out of the resources that they need to learn. Pushed out, we see here that there is a trend of over suspension of Black males across the country, primarily, again, looking at the southern region where we see as a region some of the highest suspension rates, looking at the Midwest where again you have places like Michigan and Indiana and Ohio where you see high suspension rates. And this is something that a number of organizations across the country, one coalition being Dignity in Schools, has worked to address, calling for a moratorium on out-of-school suspension because quite frankly as a tool for addressing discipline, it hasn't proven to be effective. Next slide. Equality matters. What the slide shows is 8th grade NAEP score. NAEP is the National Assessment for Educational Proficiency, and educational progress. And what we see here are the national proficiency rates. We notice that, and this is for reading and math, And if you look at the chart, it indicates that in 2013, as it relates to 8th grade reading and math, only 12% of black males were proficient in reading, and 13% proficient in math, and that's basic proficiency. That's something that our country has to address. Separate and apart from graduation issues, even if a city has a high graduation rate, if the proficiency rates are low, we have a quality issue. And so we believe that equity and excellence has to be paired together. And obviously, as we look here, and I would say to all advocates, you should know your cities and states' graduation rate, but you also want to ensure that the students are graduating with a diploma that will have them prepared for post-secondary success, whatever type of post-secondary engagement that the individual's involved in. They should be ready for some level, whether it's a 2-year college, whether it's technical, or whether it's a 4-year college. The high school diploma should prepare them for career and college success. Next slide. And we see here that there are states that are doing it better than others. Again, we see New Jersey with a relatively high proficiency rate, and I say relatively high because it's 19%, still far below where I think we would want to have a proficiency rate. Maryland at 17%, Connecticut at 15%, while New Jersey for Latino males 30%, 27% in Maryland, and Connecticut 21%. Again, these are two indicators that we definitely want to track. Next slide. Similar trends for mathematics. I won't belabor the point. These are relatively successful states, but again, relatively speaking, because I think 29% is still, although it is the top in our country for 8th grade math, I still think it's too low for where our students need to go. Next slide. Likewise, we see states that are not performing well. I mentioned Louisiana relative to the different diplomas that they are offering. And you see here they have very poor proficiency rate for black males, and also poor enrollment rates as it relates to students being enrolled in advanced placement courses, which is very important because it's been proven, even if a student struggles in an advanced placement course, that struggling student will still obtain knowledge that is very useful relative to those students who don't have access to advanced placement. And we see here Louisiana, South Carolina, Michigan are struggling as it relates to placement, black males in advanced placement, while Colorado, District of Columbia, Utah seem to be opening up doors there, and I think those are, those are good positive steps forward. Next slide. So in short, we have to begin to build healthy living and learning districts, and it's not just about one sector taking this on, but it's about, number one, government ensuring that there's equity even at the highest level. The federal government has a responsibility to ensure that regardless of where a student is born, that student has a fair and substantive opportunity to learn. But parents, community, the private sector, we also have a responsibility for aligning our resources, and philanthropy definitely, aligning our resources in such a way where we can build a pipeline and create a healthy living and learning ecosystem. Next slide. And these are just some of the examples. State and district and school systems can take on personal opportunity plans, which highlight the academic, socio-emotional, and health supports needed. I highlighted the importance of collecting and reporting data annually around graduation results. Next slide. J.P. Morgan Chase, private sector action that they've taken on is they have the fellowship initiative, which I think is an action that other private sector partners can take on. I mentioned the Dignity in School campaign calling for a moratorium on out-of-school suspension. This is something that states and localities can do, and there's a guide at stopsuspensions.org that helps states and localities reduce the use of out-of-school suspension. And then there are the community actions like the Be Me community action as a way to highlight the positive actions of males at the local level. And then there are a number of philanthropic initiatives and other resources that are available. The National Opportunity to Learn campaign, the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, the Black Male Funders Learning and Action Network, the Black Male Achievement Social Innovation Accelerator, the Sons and Brothers, sponsored by the California Endowment, the African American Men and Boys Initiative at the Heinz Endowment, the Racial Equity Resource Guide, sponsored by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and a collaborative of philanthropic efforts through the Executive Alliance for Boys and Men of Color. All of these are resources that community advocates can use, parents, school districts, and we wanted to make sure that we're not just pointing out these data so that we can shock localities, but we're highlighting these data and we highlight these actions as a way to meaningfully address the challenges and the opportunities that are present. So I want to stop there and say, while we talk about, again, black males in our report and the importance of addressing these data, these challenges are not just unique to black males, and that's why I'm glad to share this panel with Professor Crenshaw, and I want to open up the panel now for the discussion about their report. So Professor Crenshaw, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson, and I want to thank you for inviting us to this platform, and more importantly, I want to thank the Schott Foundation for their support of this important work. I want to specifically thank Cassie Schorner and Nikisha Lewis, who shepherded this project from infancy to whatever it is we call it now. It's an important investment, and it also reflects the fact that to create some space around black girls and other girls of color takes support from foundations like Schott and others who have made this a project more or less of a village as opposed to one organization. So we want to acknowledge all those who helped bring this to fruition. A recent case in Baltimore reveals a shocking incident in which the police officer embedded in a middle school was filmed beating and pepper spraying 3 African-American girls. All 3 of the girls were hospitalized, arrested, and suspended. Now, the surfacing of the video was actually fortunate for the girls because they were facing charges for the incident that were subsequently dropped. Their suspension, however, has not been dropped. They are still suspended, and they've been sent to a school for troubled youth. These images join others in which girls as young as 5 have been manhandled, cuffed, and arrested. Now, the images are disturbing, and they point to an underlying reality that black girls are often seen in the conflict over school discipline, but they aren't often heard. We also know that punishment and over-discipline does correlate to disengagement and underachievement and long-term consequences for girls and their families. But we know less about how zero-tolerance policies actually affect their attachment to school. We consider this to be part of a typical sameness difference kind of problem. We know that girls face some of the same risks from harsh disciplinary policies that their male counterparts do. They face also different circumstances. Sometimes they're punished for behaviors that boys would not, and sometimes they're burdened by responsibilities and vulnerabilities that make their compliance in zero-tolerance environments harder to sustain. The greatest difference, though, is that the level of awareness about these risks and these consequences is not well known. It's not yet firmly centered in the national efforts to improve outcomes for youth at risk. The further problem this reflects is a silo problem. So Black girls and other girls of color exist in the margins of a pipeline discourse that does focus around race, but race as it's experienced by boys. And they're also marginalized in a gender equity discourse that has focused on issues that fall far outside the discourse around zero-tolerance policies in the school-to-prison pipeline. The consequence of these separate silos is that racial disparity analysis is usually not attuned to girls, and a framework that looks at gender disparities are not attuned to girls who are of color. So what we want to be able to do is address this overlapping erasure. And to do so, we need to erase what we call the cycle of invisibility. Girls of color are often excluded from the initial framing of the crisis problem, and that in turn leads to inferences by stakeholders and others that they're doing well or they're doing well enough. That in turn contributes to an absence of girls in research and policy making, and then an under-resourcing of interventions that might be able to be scaled up when there's energy to create more robust interventions. So this cycle has to be broken in order to ensure that there's a realizable commitment to the idea that Black lives matter. So the report, Black Girls Matter, brings an intersectional framework to bear to highlight these educational and other economic and social factors that funnel Black girls and other girls of color onto pathways to nowhere. This report was a very modest project in which we assembled qualitative and quantitative data on Black girls and other girls of color in New York and in Boston. We utilized data from the 2011-2012 school year released by the Office of Civil Rights Data Collection in 2014. And we separated the males from the females in each racial and ethnic category so we could compare all groups against one another and then examine the disparate situations within the genders. So our question was, to what degree do Black girls and other girls of color face racialized risks that contribute to their separation from school? We confirmed other research that race and ethnicity are substantial risk factors for Black girls compared to their white counterparts. Nationally, Black girls were suspended 6 times as often as white girls. And surprisingly, this relative racial disparity between girls is even greater than the relative disparity between boys, who are suspended at 3 times the rate of their white counterparts. Now, looking more deeply into the OCR data submitted by New York and Boston, we confirmed that Black boys are disciplined more than any other group and several times more likely than white boys. The data also revealed that this disparity is also true for Black girls as well, who are punished at much greater rates than white girls. In terms of suspension, during the 2011-2012 school year, the suspension rates in New York show that Black girls were nearly 10 times as likely to be suspended than their white counterparts. And in Boston, it was a rate of 12 times the rate of white girls. The expulsion data is even more alarming. 90% of all the girls expelled in New York were Black. No white girls were expelled. And consequently, no ratio can actually be calculated. But the relative magnitude of this disparity might be captured if we just imagine what the ratio would be if one white girl had been expelled. Were that the case, the ratio would be 53 to 1. So this is a huge disparity. It's also a disparity that compares to the disparity in expulsion between boys, which is 10 to 1, meaning that girls actually are facing a greater racialized risk of expulsion. Now, this disparity stands true for Boston as well. During the same year, 63% of all girls who were expelled were Black. Again, no white girls were reported to have been expelled, and thus no ratio could be calculated. Now, it is important that we draw attention to these disparities and acknowledge some of the reservations that some have had about acknowledging this disparity. Some are concerned that if we focus on relative disparity between boys and girls within their gender groups, it creates a race to the bottom. We move away from aspirations to go to measurements that don't focus on deficits, and their concerns about the quality quality of the data, all of which our researchers share. And at the same time, we think that there are important aspects of racial discrimination that might not be acknowledged unless we do intra-gender comparisons to see how different racial groups play out with respect to each other. But overall, the data can only tell us so much. We really need to listen to the girls and the young women to understand these environments that they must navigate. So our project was to listen to the girls. It was modest, but in our focus groups, we heard much more about the stories behind these data. So number one, we learned that zero-tolerance environments that focused on discipline rather than learning communicated to girls that school was not about learning. Girls who dropped out indicated that the disciplinary routines discouraged them from investing in school. They also were aware that their teachers were not invested in them, and the teachers viewed them in stereotypical terms such as being loud, rowdy, ghetto, or girls who couldn't be trusted. Stakeholders theorized that Black girls were disproportionately subjected to punishment because of these perceptions, that they were defiant, that they were hard to control, and they needed to be reined in. These perceptions reflect some of the unique ways that gender and race play out and push Black girls out of school. Secondly, law enforcement didn't make girls feel secure, but instead made them feel less safe. Metal detectors dissuaded some of them from actually entering school, as some viewed the rituals around the detectors to be particularly humiliating. One of them likened the metal detectors to sexual harassment. Zero tolerance wasn't always zero tolerance, according to some of the young women. They reported that there was gender norming enforcement and how punishment was meted out. Having a beef or expressions of aggression might be expected as ordinary from boys, but girls reported receiving swifter punishment for behavior that was regarded to be anti-feminine or aggressive. And zero tolerance also left girls of color at risk for aggressions that are gendered, such as harassing behaviors. Teachers often let such behaviors go, saying boys will be boys, while at the same time subjecting both boys and girls to suspension when girls defend themselves. One girl mentioned that she was suspended along with a boy who punched her in the eye, expressing in the suspension disbelief that she would be suspended for effectively defending herself. Other stakeholders revealed that harassment in schools was not taken seriously. When one father removed his daughter because of continuing harassment, the teachers expressed relief because of perceptions that the girl was actually being distracting to the boys. So punitive responses to ordinary conflicts between girls also contribute to girls who are involved in the juvenile justice system. Several of the girls reported that fights ultimately led them directly into the juvenile justice system. And other girls left school because they wanted to avoid the system altogether, and they viewed the likelihood that they would eventually get into a fight as an inevitability, which would then make them subject to juvenile justice. Girls also indicated that stakeholders were dissuaded or felt that girls were dissuaded when investment into their achievement wasn't celebrated. Stakeholders said young people want to be valued in some way, so the occasional tepid response to achievement by girls made some of them feel like the investment was not worth it, and they sought recognition through other less productive behaviors that are neither healthy nor conducive to their long-term well-being. So this was a warning about the unintended consequences of assuming that the girls are okay and focusing a lion's share on the resources on celebrating when we've been able to rescue our boys, which is important, but we also have to remember that the girls also read those messages and sometimes take the wrong inference. We also noted that many of the girls expressed untreated trauma related to sexual violence and other kinds of violence as contributing to what is seen as behavioral problems. One girl talked about having been raped and how the guidance counselors were ill-equipped to deal with that level of trauma. She eventually expressed that trauma through an outburst against one of her teachers and was subsequently expelled from school. According according to the Black Women's Blueprint, 60% of Black girls experience sexual assault of some type before they turn 18. These factors have sometimes contributed to girls understanding that the best way for them to get attention, as they say, was to give face or to act out. And that acting out tended to lead to more disciplinary interventions rather than therapeutic ones. We also discovered that factors outside of the school undermined their attachment. They had familial obligations, and not simply girls who are parenting, but girls who are facing some of the consequences of this shredding social safety net. So many of the girls talked about having to take care of children of their siblings who are incarcerated, or children of their siblings who are facing mental illness. They were the children, or they were the ones responsible for taking care of elderly people, helping their parents navigate social service systems, particularly when they were bilingual. So these kinds of obligations often made it difficult for girls to get to school on time. It made it unlikely for them to want to give up their cell phones, which was one of the things that a lot of them complained about. And in a zero-tolerance environment where heavy punishments get attached to failure to attend school or to truancy, the gender-related causes for that truancy may often make girls more subject to these push-out factors. Those girls who are mothers report fewer programs that allow them to parent while attending school, and they also indicated that their own sense that school was not safe made them unlikely to take these opportunities to task. And finally, stakeholders noted that the educational mission of providing analysis and tools to help girls mature into adulthood were often missing from the typical zero-tolerance environments. They indicated that girls need specific opportunities to work and to learn with each other, both inside and out of school. So our recommendations. We have taken up many of the suggestions given by stakeholders and girls to expand opportunities for girls to be included in policy research, advocacy, and programmatic interventions. Gender specificity is important, but gender-exclusive interventions should be informed by real information, not by speculation or myth or the false perception that our girls are doing okay, the girls are not okay. Girls also must be safe in school, and the safety shouldn't come from further enhancement of punitive prison-like environments, interventions that help with conflict resolution between girls, and that encourage appropriate behavior against harassing and bullying are to be prioritized. The funneling of girls into juvenile justice must be more thoroughly understood and stemmed at every point along the continuum. Although school-based arrests aren't common for girls, their relationship to dropout and system involvement is so significant that it must be minimized as much as possible. Efforts to address trauma must be developed as punitive interventions decrease. Pregnant and parenting students have special needs that are difficult to address. And finally, the success of our interventions really turns on the quality of our data. This intersectional research is often challenging because the way data is or is not reported. So as our field continues to grow, we need data collection strategies to be more uniform and presented in ways that permit reliable analysis of the intersectional dimensions facing girls. Public will has to be developed to address these challenges. This can't be a trickle-down affair. It has to be taken up aggressively so that teachers, administrators, community leaders, and families are enabled to address the institutional factors that undermine the well-being of girls and women of color. The African American Policy Forum and our research partner, the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies, has been attempting to create these moments where girls and women can tell the stories of being pushed out and some of the other aspects of their lives that need to be lifted up. This work continues in the next several months in Baltimore and D.C., Philadelphia, Cleveland, and New Orleans. So we want to thank the Schott Foundation for making this work possible, for listening to Black girls and girls of color, and we look forward to increasing partnerships with those in the sphere to continue to lift up some of the challenges facing girls. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much to both our speakers here. Want to remind folks that you can use the chat function on the webinar platform to send us any questions. Just send them over to the host or to all panelists. So we do have a few questions that have already come in throughout the course of the presentation, so let's dig in with those. Dr. Jackson, this first one is probably more for you. Wanted to talk about the difference between graduation rates and dropout rates as it was defined in the Schott Foundation report.
So the graduation rates are calculated, the state rates are calculated using OCR data, looking at our Department of Education data, looking at the cohorts, taking the 9th grade entering cohort and looking at the 12th grade exiting cohort, and through that calculation determining the graduation rate. The dropout rates are also reported at the state and local level. And as I mentioned, in many states or localities, they use a different formula for calculating these dropout rates. So much so, like the example I mentioned, in some of the states, they were only calculating dropouts, a student as a dropout if the student called back and said, I'm no longer returning. So really it's a difference in methodology, and up until 2011 there wasn't a uniform way for calculating dropout graduation rates. The Department of Education published some guidance on that, and more states and localities need to follow a uniform system for calculating dropouts also.
All right. The second question is probably for the both of you. I want to talk a bit about colorism in this racial and gender analysis, and to what extent that impacts the statistics that we're seeing and the stories that we're hearing. Who'd like to go first?
Yeah, so our particular study was built on some of the observations that others have found about the impact on colorism, and in fact the inference that colorism might even play a greater role in separating out black girls who are dark-skinned for punishment and intervention than male counterparts as well. We were not looking specifically for colorism per se. Race was simply marked by self-identification, and so we believe that our report suggests that the overall disparity welcomes more effort to look to see if those disparities reflect the colorism that other researchers have found. Overall, I think that opening up this entire arena to the specificities around color, and I'll go more deeply into say the specificities of anti-black racism as they play out against black students as a whole and black women and girls in particular, is perhaps one of the most important new directions that this research can take.
Yeah, likewise, we didn't necessarily delve into the issue of colorism, but like Professor Crenshaw, I believe that what we are focused on, and what we did focus on, is looking at the unique issues that create these disparities. Because quite frankly, I've said it a number of times, this is not normal. It's not normal to be able to statistically identify by race or gender who's more likely to drop out, who's more likely to be suspended, who's less likely to graduate. That is not a normal occurrence. It is created by the policies and practices which are put in place at the federal, state, and local level.
All right, the next question is talking a bit about the framing that we see in the national narrative when we talk about graduation rates and suspension rates. Donna Ford, one of our attendees, noted that with the Schott report, we have a section that focuses on AP placement, or the number of students enrolled in AP courses. And likewise, a video that accompanied that report is really trying to flip the narrative on the contributions of black men to our nation's economy and democracy. And I'm sure the African American Policy Forum also encountered these types of narratives and the need for a shift in the way we talk about young men and young women of color in our schools and in our economy. Would either of you two like to elaborate on that and the narrative?
Well, I'll just observe, first of all, that it is very important to figure out how to create a framework that both lifts up the contributions that are currently made and the potential growth of the contributions that can be made if these barriers and obstacles are attended to and removed. So we think it's important to reframe these efforts as efforts to remove barriers and obstacles rather than efforts to fix in some way children who are seen as being the embodiments of deficits. That is one of the problems in sometimes framing these issues as these children need development as opposed to we need to figure out what's happening in these environments that contribute to their push-out and their underachievement. I'll say more specifically a challenge with respect to Black girls is that we need to be very careful to both acknowledge that they're resilient, but not to use their resilience as a justification for disregard or for assuming that since they are resilient, we don't really have to attend to the circumstances in which they have to be. I mean, you know, roses can grow through concrete, but they shouldn't have to. And so what we need to do is recognize that resilience is even more productive when the environment is such that they don't have to face some of the barriers and obstacles, and that those obstacles shouldn't be normalized.
Yeah, and briefly, what we tried to do through the video was just that, remind the country that this population is an asset. Although, you know, too often in the media, students of color are framed as from a deficit model. You know, quite frankly, we highlight the data from Detroit where the graduation rate for Black males is under 20%. Well, for those white males that are educated in Detroit, it's under 20% also. So it's really a way to say that our public education system, as the only mandatory institution, network of mandatory institutions across the country, could and should be serving as a platform to connect students with the supports that they need to render the opportunities and the assets that their community needs. So it's not a matter of you know, race or ethnicity. What makes it a matter of race or ethnicity is more often than not we relegate students of color to under-resourced spaces, and we're less likely to provide them with the supports that they need to succeed. And like Professor Crenshaw said, just because there are some who overcome, we can't use that as justification for continuing a cycle of not addressing the supports that are necessary, because those supports are going to be increasingly necessary for all students.
All right, great. So I think there's been a number of questions so far from several people about digging in really into the specific recommendations of both reports, particularly in the areas of so what besides discipline changes, changes to discipline policies can we employ in our classrooms, and then are there other things like particularly for teachers and training for educators that would help with some of these disparities that we're seeing as well? Dr. Jackson, would you like to go first?
Well, I think we know that there are a host of steps that can be taken. That's why we try to outline several actions that several entities could take, from improving, you know, teacher quality to delivering the academic, socio-emotional, and health support. So anyone who says that if we just did X, we could fix the problem, like Reverend Barber, president of the NAACP in North Carolina, said, there's no silver bullet. We're not trying to kill a werewolf. The problem is more complex than that, but the problem at the core of it is about caring enough about these students' success to identify what those supports are. And as the Black Girls Matter report indicates, typically when we think about student success, we only think about those academic supports. Well, it's a little more that's needed. As the Black Girls Matter report indicates, if we care about a young Black girl achieving at a high level and having the opportunity to learn to succeed, we should also care enough to put in place some child care support, and not just child care support for that individual young lady who may have a child, but the problem is much larger because she may also have to take care of a sibling, a cousin, or what have you. Those are core supports that are necessary to provide students an opportunity to learn. So it's a host of issues. I think it starts through aligning the resources at the local level, using the public education and the school as a platform to align those resources. It's complex, but it's very much solvable.
And I agree wholeheartedly with everything Dr. Jackson said, and want to emphasize the overall push here, which is to rethink and hopefully banish to history the idea that these schools should primarily focus on discipline and punishment as ways of encouraging affirmative kind of behavior. I think the one thing that the Black Girls Matter report consistently does is reinforces the idea that punishment is not an effective solution to many of the challenges that our youth of color are facing in public education. And if that's the only thing that people take from it, it would really be, I think, the most important thing. I think subsequent to that is, so what does it mean in order to rethink the entire function and dynamic of these institutions? One has to get beyond punishment in order to then think about, well, what kinds of resources need to be there? How do we go about assessing what the needs of the student population is? How do we go about assessing the sometimes gender-specific needs of the population? And one of the things that I think comes from this is that when we think about cultural competence in our teachers, we have to think about both race and gender in thinking about that competence. One of the disturbing things about the video that I started with was this was intra-racial, intra-gender. This is a Black police officer basically beating Black girls under the assumption, apparently, that these girls needed that kind of discipline. So there are a lot of challenges that we have to face in confronting the fact that we viewed our children in a certain way. We have thought certain interventions are necessary to conform their behavior in ways that often reflect gender norms that are questionable, rather than pathways that are absolutely necessary for our children to be successful. So we need an entire rethinking, and that rethinking needs to start with, first of all, getting more accurate information, but secondly, building the public will to see this as a fundamental challenge rather than one that can be focused on a few underperforming students or a few underperforming schools.
All right, I think we've got time for maybe one more question. I apologize if we don't manage to get to everyone's question on this webinar. Thanks for sending all of your questions, everyone. We will have both these reports are currently available online. If you want to keep sending us questions, we can, over social media and online. Our Twitter handles for both Schott and the African American Policy Forum and our Facebook pages are both listed on your screen right now. So last question, I think, will be, how can we use the recommendations that are in these reports and bring them to the attention of sort of the broader education reform space that right now is focused on a lot of other issues, something like, Common Core, extended day learning, and mass school closures, and how do we bring the issues that are highlighted in these reports to that debate?
Well, I think that this is one of the reasons why we continue to focus on the public will, developing the public will, educating the public, the stakeholders, and others in the educational sphere about the magnitude of these challenges and the specific recommendations. But a more targeted effort that we believe is important is to actually develop a report card for our elected officials and other leadership to be able to measure the extent to which they address these problems. We're coming up in the next several months on another important presidential campaign. I think being able to use this moment to talk about public policy with a specific emphasis on what has happened in education over the last couple of decades is an ideal moment for us to actually build the political will and the expectation that those who lead us will be concerned not solely about our status and stature in the wider public arena, but be concerned about the future of our young people. And that's something that should be a priority for all of us who are engaged in the democratic process.
And I think that it's going to take really some of the steps that Professor Crenshaw and Keisha Lewis and Cassie Swarner and others have taken to elevate this issue impacting girls in the gender equity space, because as Professor Crenshaw opened, it is something that has too often been ignored. But it's because of their persistence that we see some level of momentum in addressing this very specific issue. So how do we take these recommendations and how do we institutionalize them? Number one, I think you got to start and recognize it's going to take a level of persistence. You may not be able to change them at the federal level or even the state, but you may have the capacity to build that campaign at the local level, where, quite frankly, it allows you to identify what the relevant data points are, align the relevant resources, and touch the relevant students right where you are. Too often, I think we believe that in order to bring about the change, we have to change the country overnight. I think change can happen, as it has in the past, in localities across the country, locality by locality, so that we change the national tone. And through that, we will see some level of a domino effect of policy changing at the state level and at the federal level. So I would hope that we would use these reports, number one, to care about the communities that we live in, and then number two, to align with other communities to change things at the state level and build a movement to change the national tone. But it's through these discussions, and that's why, again, I want to thank Professor Crenshaw and those involved in producing the Black Girls Matter report, and thank all of you all for participating today.
All right, thanks everyone for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this webinar. We've been recording the whole thing, and we will post it online. We have everyone's email from your registration, and we'll make sure to send you all the link. You can connect with both organizations on social media. Schott Foundation is @SchottFound, and the African American Policy Forum is @AA Policy Forum. Thanks again, and we hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.